To conclude our discussion on climate, we are going to talk for the next few videos about air pollution. Now, air pollution is definitely not a new problem. Air pollution has been an issue for humans ever since we first discovered fire. Back in the days of the cavemen, they had to deal with smoke in caves. So air pollution has always been an issue. As far as large quantities in open areas, that's more of a recent problem, but yes, air pollution has always been an issue. The first recorded actual law, so the first legislation made on air pollution was made in the year 1273 by King Edward I. He noticed that there were certain types of coal that created a lot more soot. And so he outlawed sea coal. Today we know that it's a major source not only of soot, but also of sulfur dioxide as well. And so definitely that helped out a lot with the pollution problems that London had back then and still has today. In 1661, London was very well known for its very filthy air. They had what they would call pea soup fog. It's a combination of smoke and fog, or a common term for that today is smog. And smog is very thick, very thick. And in London, it was so thick that it was thick like pea soup, so they called it pea soup fog. And London was very well known for this type of air by the 1600s, and in 1661 they had a major event that they had weather patterns that made the pollution problem worse, which killed off a number of people. 1873 they had another one of these incidences where 700 people were killed just from a weather event that allowed this pea soup fog to form. In 1911, over 1,000 people were killed. And then 1952, nearly 4,000 people died in a lingering smog. And you can see a picture of that event here in this photograph. And you can hardly see across the square. You can maybe see an outline of a building on the other side of the square, but it is so thick. It is really bad. So nearly 4,000 people died in 1952 because of this. So a few years later, Parliament passed legislation. In 1956, they passed the Clean Air Act, which was meant to restrict the amount of pollution that can be emitted into the air. So they've had continuous work by London, and if any of you have ever been to London, you know that it's much cleaner. You don't see this type of situation anymore. It can still create a lot of smog, but it's much cleaner today. Here in the United States, we've had our own issues. The industrial states of Ohio and Pennsylvania, Missouri, all the way from Missouri up St. Louis, Missouri through Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That area is very well known for their industry, and they create a lot of pollution. In fact, Pittsburgh itself is known as the Smoky City. By 1940, cars were needing to drive through in the middle of the day with their headlights on, especially during weather events that allowed the air pollution to build up. An event in October of 1948 in Daytona, Pennsylvania, had a lingering smog that killed 20 people and thousands more became ill. Los Angeles is very famous for their photochemical smog. And so United States followed in the steps of London and initiated the Clean Air Act of 1970. Both the Clean Air Act of London and the Clean Air Act of the United States have been updated many times since they were first established and have created stricter standards and even incentives to promote cleaner air. Okay, so that's the history of pollution, but now I need to ask, what is pollution? How do we define pollution? Well, a pollutant is an airborne substance that threatens health if the concentrations are high enough. So, for example, carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. However, if the concentration is high enough, then it can start causing brain asphyxia. That is when it becomes a pollutant. But just walking outside, there's carbon dioxide all over the place. You're breathing it all the time. It's not a pollutant. Only when it starts to threaten health. Where do pollutants come from? Well, there are lots of natural sources and there are human sources. Natural sources may be places like volcanoes or windstorms that pick up dust or forest fires or the decay of plant life. There are a large number of natural sources. But there are also plenty of human sources, as we know. Industries, automobiles, power plants, so we could go on and on and on. We separate the different pollutants caused by humans as either a primary source or a secondary source. A primary source is where the pollutant is created and then it enters directly into the atmosphere. For example, humans breathe, and when they exhale carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide just goes straight into the atmosphere and builds up in the atmosphere. That would be so breathing would be a primary source for carbon dioxide. A secondary source would be where the pollutant creates a chemical reaction with some other chemical that's in the atmosphere. So, and then that chemical reaction produces a pollutant. For example, ozone. Ozone is created through the incomplete combustion of automobiles. Ozone itself isn't the healthiest thing to be breathing, especially in large concentrations. But usually the ozone that we have around is not high enough concentration. Not usually, I should say. Usually. But that ozone hanging around in the atmosphere will combine with nitrogen oxide compounds, something we call NOx. So that combines with ozone, O3, and that produces a secondary pollutant. So that would be an example of a secondary source. And then also you can define the two different pollutants as fixed or mobile sources.